Welcome to Lesky, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Henning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. If you do a quick Google image search for something like ancient Greek colonization, you'll find a lot of maps that all look pretty similar. Mainland Greece sitting neatly at the center, with arrows pointing out from it in every direction across the Mediterranean. But what if that whole picture, a picture we often see and that we often teach, is misleading? My guest for this episode, archaeologist Naoíse Mac Sweeney, has been leading a massive multi-year ERC research project called Migration and the Making of the Ancient Greek World, or MIGMAG for short. The aim of MIGMAG has been to reconsider the messy reality of migration in the ancient Mediterranean. Naoíse had long been dissatisfied with old narratives about Greek colonization and the so-called rise of the polis, and so she set out to lead a team to see whether the actual data might be telling a different story. This ambitious kind of multi-year teamwork is hugely important. Most of us have been conditioned to view ancient history through the lens of empires and nation-states, treating mainland Greece as the absolute center of the universe, and civilization is radiating out from it. But by looking at how actual local populations lived and shifted on a regional scale, MIGMAG is starting to dismantle that set of myths. Just consider the sheer scale of what Naoíse's team has attempted. They bridged 5 distinct regions of the Mediterranean, stretching from modern-day Turkey to Sardinia, and collected data sets from fields of study that are rarely put in dialogue with one another, like archaeobotany and philology. So on this episode, you'll be hearing us talk about how Naoíse first conceived of the project and how the team approached such enormous data sets. Something that particularly excited me was hearing Naoíse explain how it can be possible to think of ancient texts almost like we think of physical artifacts. The ERC-funded portion of MIGMAG formally closed out June 30th, the day before this episode dropped. But MIGMAG's work is still very much underway. The first edited volume is in press, and another one is scheduled to follow. Already, Naoíse and her team are rewriting the history of archaic Greece and making all those neat diaspora-based Google images obsolete. This is the last episode of Lesky's second season. By one count, it's also the 50th episode. There have been 45 regular episodes, 4 bonus ones back in season 1, and then there was also the trailer. I want to say a big thank you to all of our listeners, especially the regular ones. And I'm also especially grateful to anyone who's taken the time to drop me a note or leave a rating or review of the podcast or recommend it to a friend or even use it in the classroom. The listenership is still growing steadily. And now, after 2 years, it's nice to feel that what started as just an idea has become a body of work, some 50 episodes strong. Thank you again for listening, and have a great rest of the summer. Lesky will be back in your feed with an all-new and very exciting episode the second Wednesday of September, which is September 9th. Naoíse Mac Sweeney is Professor of Classical Archaeology at the University of Vienna. Her work focuses on the construction of identity and cultural interaction in the Iron Age to Classical Greek world, with a particular focus on Anatolia. A subsidiary strand of her research considers the intersection of modern politics and reception. She's the author of books including Community Identity and Archaeology, which came out in 2011, Foundation Myths and Politics in Ancient Ionia from 2013, Troy, Myth, City, Icon from 2018, and most recently, The West, A New History of an Old Idea from 2023. Just a quick reminder that, as ever, I have put a few references in the show notes. And again, Lesky is on Instagram at Lesky Podcast. That's where I announce new episodes, so you might want to follow us there. Now, I'd like to welcome into the Lesky Naoíse Mac Sweeney. The next voice you'll be hearing is hers.
The project itself took a very specific form as an ERC-sponsored research project, and we're very, very grateful, of course, to the European Research Council for funding the project. But in a sense, it's kind of a culmination of a series of other projects which were bubbling under for a good decade before this one ever got started, really. So for me, it came from 2 different directions simultaneously. So one was a deep intellectual dissatisfaction with kind of questions and debates around the theme of Greek colonization, or rather this debate that there was about the nature of what Greek colonization fundamentally was. So this question of how various Greek communities came into being, and in a sense, explaining the map of the ancient Greek world, this map which has Greek communities stretched out across the entire length and breadth of the Mediterranean and Black Sea, from, Spain to Cyprus, and from the Crimea down to Cyrenaica. And the explanations given for why this map looks the way it were always explanations which were premised on migration and mobility, and specifically kind of a diasporic movement of Greek people and Greek speakers with a Greek identity who start off in the Aegean and they move outwards. So it's premised on diaspora. And there have been decades of academic debate about the nature of this diasporic movement. Is it all about colonization, as the traditional narrative frames it? So it's kind of Greeks going out to conquer and settle and dominate new places. Or discourse had it that it's got more to do with patterns of trade and exchange and entrepreneurialism and local communities integrating with and mixing with and mingling with migrant opportunistic Greek settlers. And I found both of these interpretive frameworks being really deeply problematic. I mean, the first being obviously kind of proto-imperialist, and the second one being very, very actually capitalist, coming out of a kind of a late 20th century capitalist utopian mindset, where the ancient Mediterranean is almost characterized by freedom of economic movement. And there was very little violence in these narratives. There was very little domination and resistance. Everybody was very happily hybridizing all over the Mediterranean. And so I found this quite difficult. And I found that it too wrote out the local voices and local histories. So that was really the core of what prompted me to look into the subject in more detail. At the same time, from a very practical perspective, my first postdoctoral project, kind of which began way back in 2007, was I was excavating with one of my old professors in Cilicia, which is in south of the southern part of modern day Turkey. And we were looking at Iron Age to Archaic levels within this inland settlement. And I actually spent then about the best part of 10 years working in this region. And something that I really noticed was a shift in the settlement patterns in the region over time, whereby there was this move down towards the coast. Everybody was focused inland for centuries and centuries. And then around the 7th century, they all ended up trickling down towards the coast. And it's a region which is often associated with Greek colonization. And it just occurred to me that if we didn't have the framework, the conceptual framework of Greek colonization, we would easily explain the appearance of new coastal cities by the fact that people are moving out of inland river valleys, right? It was really obvious to me, having spent kind of 10 years working in these river valleys, that people were moving from the inland areas to the coast. And that totally explained why these new coastal cities came into being. We didn't need external migrants. We didn't need Greek colonization. So 10 years of working in rural Cilicia and many, many years of being kind of intellectually dissatisfied with these academic debates came together very gradually. And so I kind of had the idea for trying to build a project to see whether what I was seeing in Cilicia was also happening in other parts of the ancient Greek world. And so it started off slowly. It ended up building collaborations in different regions. And out the end of it, we managed to build a larger scale comparative project, which looked at 5 different regions of the Mediterranean and how cities and communities were established and founded in these 5 regions, and whether we could trace the foundations of the early growth of these communities to external or local migration. And that was really the impetus behind putting this whole project together.
So what were the 5 regions that you chose to focus on? And also, what were the chronological bookends that you set?
We ended up going with regions that were practical to work in, that I had good working relationships with archaeologists who are already doing fieldwork and archaeological survey in these regions, but also places which made sense intellectually as well. So we were working in moving from east to west. We were working in Cilicia, which was where I had been working for many years. And that is a quote unquote colonial Greek region, but it's also very much on the fringes of the ancient Near East. It was part of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and part of the Achaemenid Empire. So it had a certain flavor to it. The second region working westwards, that we looked at was Ionia, which is the westernmost coast of Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey, so the Aegean coast. And this is also supposed to be a Greek colonial region, but it had been Greek for much longer, supposedly colonized or in the early Iron Age rather than in the Archaic period. So that was the second region that we looked at, which provided quite a nice contrast. We then wanted to have a look at a region within Greece itself, Peninsular Greece, the so-called Greek homeland, as a kind of control to understand whether everything else in the wider Mediterranean was the same or different, or actually are the same patterns visible everywhere, but we're just writing about them differently. So we ended up, after a while, going around, and we ended up settling on Locris, and East Locris in particular, as a region which has a very kind of strong ethnos and koinon identity, but also has the emergence of one or two poleis as well. So we wanted to have that comparison. And that was also linked to our fourth region, which is Calabria in southern Italy. Of course, so some of the foundation myths that we have for this region link this region back to Locris, which we thought was particularly nice. And here is another typical Greek colonial region, which is often cited as kind of a type case for Greek colonization. The fifth and final region that we thought we'd look at was actually not a Greek region at all. So we looked at central western Sardinia, which is of course associated with Phoenician rather than Greek colonization. And the idea behind this was, I thought it'd be really exciting as a contrast. Again, if we have Greek and Phoenician and regions alongside each other, do they all develop in the same way? Do they develop in different ways? Is our differential labeling of these regions is that coming from the actual material, or is that coming from something else entirely? So that was part of the way we wanted to frame the question.
And how did you choose the dates that you were interested in, the range of time?
We ended up looking at slightly different time periods in all of our 5 case study regions. And that was really tied to when we saw the establishment of these major new cities. So when we're looking at this in Ionia, for example, it's relatively early. We're looking from the 11th century onwards. But in regions like Calabria or Cilicia, this is much later. This is kind of 7th century. So the time span ended up really expanding. So we're looking really at the very start of the early Iron Age, from 1200s onwards, right up to the opening of the classical period. The chronological focus points were different for different regions, but it was really helpful to get that long sense of time span and shift over time.
Could you say a little bit more about your dissatisfaction intellectually with these models that had been very dominant to account for the, I guess, geographic dispersal of the Greeks in this period? So the first being colonization, which you mentioned, but also longstanding narratives, which are also being challenged, have been challenged more recently, but about the rise, the so-called rise of the polis. How were these kinds of narratives, or what was your instinct telling you about how these kinds of narratives might be obscuring what had actually been going on?
It was always confusing to me why we would talk about the kind of the establishment of Greek cities on mainland Greece and in the central Aegean as the rise of the polis. We would frame it in terms of an entirely indigenous phenomenon, which was to do with sun oikism, and it was to do with kind of centralized collective organization and the coming together of a people or sets of people, and that we would frame this entirely differently in the Aegean, and we'd frame it with a different language entirely outside the Aegean. And there was relatively little interest in talking about the role of migrants, perhaps, in the Aegean in promoting or creating or stimulating the birth of new communities. And so I really wanted to look at a region within so-called Greece proper and compare it using exactly the same methodology, the same expectations with so-called colonial Greek regions, to really investigate whether they were actually different or whether actually we see the same kinds of processes happening in both.
Could you say a little bit about your methodology? How then did you begin to get at these questions in these 5 regions?
So what I realized quite quickly is that we really needed to untangle what we thought we knew about the foundation of these communities from what we actually know. And that really meant extracting the graphical information from foundation myths, from literary sources, these long-standing traditions from antiquity itself about the origins of these cities, and not confusing what we were seeing on the ground with what we had read about in the text. And that I think was absolutely a cornerstone of the project. And that didn't mean ignoring the foundation myths entirely, didn't mean kind of packing them aside and saying they're not true or uninteresting. What it meant was actually delving into them more and understanding what they were functioning to do. How do these foundation myths function? What were they really saying, and how do they work as historical discourses in and of their own right, rather than as nuggets of preserved memory? So the methodology then ended up being twofold. It was really important to split off an analysis of the foundation myths and that mythical material from a more archaeological analysis, which really focused on what could be found on and in the ground. So we had two main work packages within the project. One involved the systematic collection of all information that we could get about foundation and origin myths for cities and communities within our case study regions. So, for example, within Ionia, we were set about to collect all the myths that we could gather about the origins of Miletus, about the origins of Ephesus, about the origins of Smyrna, but also all the myths that we could find out about the origins of Ionia as a region as a whole. And so, for example, in the case of Ionia, we gathered about just over 400 passages of text from 115 different ancient authors. And so we went and did this for all of our different regions. And so on the mythological side, we ended up with a corpus of nearly 2,000 passages of relevant literary texts written by about 236 individual authors. Now, of course, some authors wrote about several different regions, so they appear in different kind of subcorpora. So that was one strand of work, then, was building this mythological corpus and understanding what the foundation myths were doing over time. And one of the things we really sought to do here was to understand the historical contexts in which these myths were written. The idea being that these stories are perhaps more interesting for what they tell us about the moment that they're written in, rather than the moment they're written about. So we were really interested to find, for example, that there were particular points in time when it was much more common to write about origin myths in certain different genres of writing. So sometimes it appears in historiography, sometimes it occurs much more in rhetoric, and that this is different for different regions of the ancient Greek world. And we also found it was particularly interesting that there were moments of antiquity when stories about female founders were much more popular or in vogue. There were moments of antiquity when heroic individual founders were very much in vogue, and moments when actually people preferred to tell stories of collective origin and collective foundation, where you don't have heroes leading, you have kind of whole groups of people founding new cities together. And so understanding that kind of context of kind of overall trends and patterns in the corpus of origin myths over all of classical antiquity, this really helped us to understand what these stories were doing.
For these 5 regions, then, the data that you were looking at and aggregating and analyzing was largely about 2 main things, right? So settlement patterns and landscape use. Is that right? Could you say a little bit about those 2 rubrics, the settlement patterns and landscape use?
So within the archaeological work package of this project, we looked at 2 kinds of data then. So for settlement patterns, really we were dependent on evidence from archaeological surveys. So we really wanted to understand where people were living and where they were active within the landscape and how this was changing over time. So simple questions. Did people mostly live on the coast? Did they mostly live in the uplands? Did they live in large settled nucleated communities, or were they dispersed across the landscape in small villages or in farmsteads? And for that, really, we had to pull together information from a whole bunch of different archaeological surveys done at very different points in time with sometimes very different standards of research and documentation. So we pulled all that data together, and from that we were able to aggregate kind of a large scale view of changing settlement patterns over the course of 6 or 7 centuries in each of our 5 case study regions. So that was settlement patterns. At the same time, to get a sense of regional demographics, we thought it would be very important to understand landscape use and agropastoral productivity as well. This tells us a little bit about how densely occupied the landscape was, which gives us a sense of the overall shifts in population over time. And for that, we were really looking at various markers in terms of environmental archaeology, in particular sediments, which told us about what kinds of crops were being grown at different times, but also evidence from excavated archaeobotanical deposits as well. So that was another strand of work to aggregate as much data as we could about the environmental archaeology of each of these regions as well.
And so you do have the first edited volume from the project is now in press, right? So the local migration and the making of the ancient world, circa 1200 to 550 BCE. Was it then that more archaeological package that informed this first volume, or what's the kind of general scope of this first edited volume from the project?
No, that's exactly it. So this first output from the project, this first edited volume that's on its way, that brings together all the archaeological work. It brings together the environmental archaeology work. It brings together the studies of settlement patterns across all of our 5 regions. And what we wanted to do is bring it all together, also invite other contributors to contribute kind of similar works that they've done in nearby regions, and then also try and do the work of comparison between different regions. And that's what's coming out in this current book.
Well, maybe now would be a good time to talk a little bit about these really key terms for you, which are migration and mobility. And could you maybe just start by, even though it might seem a bit banal, but just by distinguishing between these two terms?
So we decided that we were going to define migration very closely, and we were going to define it as the permanent movement of people, the permanent movement of residential mobility from one place to another. It's basically people moving house over a significant distance. And we wanted to distinguish that so that it was conceptually different from mobility, which we felt was a larger, more general catch-all term for people moving in all kinds of directions. So that could also include movement around for trade, seasonal mobility if you are a shepherd and you're moving up into the highlands for the summer and down into the lowlands for the winter. Those kinds of movements we felt were not migration in the same way, whereas migration we felt was upping your whole center of life and shifting it to a spatially distinct and separate location.
And one of the hypotheses that you had going into the project had to do with the distance of movement, right? That perhaps in the past people had largely, especially with migration, focused on very long distance movement, but you were interested in movement on maybe slightly different scales. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, in archaeology, we're all geared up for identifying cases of long distance movement. Like everything, all of our methodologies are really focused towards that. We can see when objects are imported, when we have new or innovative or intrusive styles of material culture, that's very obvious to us. Even more kind of modern scientific methodologies such as kind of petrographic analysis, neutron activation analysis, or even kind of ADNA work, this and even also stable isotopes work, this all spots when people or objects have moved quite long distances. What we're much less good at understanding if somebody has moved house from, the next door village or the next door valley. This is not something that's really archaeologically visible. It's not visible in the kinds of material culture that we see, in changes of social practices, nor even in the chemical makeup sometimes. The thing is that these movements are important, however. These much more local and regional movements are actually, and if we look at this kind of cross temporally through history, this is much more frequently how migration has occurred. And in particular, migration linked to rapid urbanization and the growth of cities. A lot of the migration that drives that is rural to urban migration carried out over a regional basis. And that is precisely the kinds of migration which we're not very well equipped to see archaeologically. The only way we can get at it is through looking at settlement patterns, looking at environmental archaeology, and bringing those two together. And we can try and see the shifts of demographic gravity within a region.
You mentioned some examples just now, but I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the new archaeological technologies that are facilitating this kind of research. What sort of developments have we seen in recent years that is helping you to shed light on these questions?
Well, something which was really interesting for us was relatively new approaches to conducting stable isotope analysis on archaeobotanical samples, so often seeds and grains. And from that, you can get a sense of how heavily a crop has been manured or how heavily it's been watered. And from that, you can get an index of how intensive agriculture is at any particular point in time. So you can get a sense of whether people are really intensively using their landscape and manuring it and irrigating it to get the most agricultural produce out of that landscape, or whether they're conducting the agriculture in a much more relaxed and expansive kind of way. And that can give you a sense of how dense the population is and how much kind of pressure the kind of the agro-pastoral system is under at a point in time. So that was a really useful and interesting new methodology which has emerged.
Yeah, that's a great example. So maybe you could say a little bit, Nisha, about with this first edited volume that is now in production, what were some of the key findings of it? I mean, you brought together so many different people working in so many different areas. Were there any kind of broad stroke, I don't want to go so far maybe as to say conclusions, but patterns that seem to emerge?
Yeah, so absolute spoiler alert, you don't need to read the book now though, but there are really significant differences in the way that different regions developed in terms of urbanization. But the differences are perhaps not the ones that we might expect. So we do see regions which the development of early cities and the foundation of cities does seem to have been a very indigenous local development, which is kind of coming out of long-standing patterns within the landscape, kind of intensification and of settlement nucleation. And some of the regions where we see that are perhaps not surprising. Like we know that happens in Ionia, which was always thought to have been a region of very long-standing Greek occupation anyway. There are some regions where we see a much clearer horizon, where cities do just suddenly emerge and where there seems to be really good evidence for external impetus in the creation of new communities. And I don't want to use the word colonization, but long distance migration and the arrival of people from quite far away, really prompting and stimulating the growth of new communities. And what's interesting is that while some of the regions which show good evidence for that are not surprising. So we really see that in Sardinia very, very clearly. And that's not all that surprising, given what we think of the history of Sardinia. It's perhaps not that surprising that we see that also in Calabria, given that what we think of that as a Greek colonial region. But what's perhaps more surprising is that we see a very, very similar developmental trajectory in central Greece, in the area of East Locris as well. So this is a region which we would traditionally have thought of as a place where we have indigenous local developments couched in terms of the rise of the polis and all those kind of traditional narratives. But actually, the signature on the landscape makes it look much more like a quote unquote colonial landscape than a quote unquote homeland landscape.
So what defines or what are the characteristics of a more colonial landscape?
Yeah, so these landscapes where the development of urbanization does seem to be linked to kind of a sudden rise in external connectivities and perhaps external migration, immigration, this is often characterized by kind of long-standing traditions and communities inland, dispersed but very long-rooted communities in these kind of upland areas. But then this sudden appearance of new communities on the coast, which are heavily urbanized very rapidly, but do not necessarily engage in the same networks. They're not necessarily networked to the longer standing settlements which are inland. And this is something that we absolutely see in East Locris with the sudden appearance of new polis, such as Halles, for example. It really just pops up out of nowhere. And it doesn't look like the people who have come to populate this place have moved from those longer established settlements inland. The settlements and land carry on doing their thing. People are still there, rooted in their networks. And this is just something which kind of is a layer of settlement, a whole new type of settlement, which is layered on top. It's not something which emerges out of those longer standing regional dynamics. So in contrast to that, at a similar time, so in kind of the 7th century, simultaneously in Cilicia, you have the sudden appearance of new coastal settlements. But yet we can see that within a longer term context of interactions with inland regions. And so we can actually almost see the population moving from the inland region to the coast in the case of Cilicia. So in a sense, that's regional migration rather than overseas migration. Whereas in Locris, the people from the inland region aren't going anywhere, right? They're still there inland. Whoever's come to occupy these new communities on the coast is probably linked into a much wider maritime network.
Right, but we don't know who that was.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say, I don't want to necessarily talk about Phoenician colonization of central Greece, but
the sea people, yeah.
We could talk about Phoenician colonization of central Greece. I mean, there are certainly, this is one of the things that emerged out of conversations with kind of the colleagues who are working in different areas. And there are areas, including kind of the eastern coast of Attica, where we might want to point to small coastal communities, which are these Levantine colonists or migrants who have, established communities on the fringes of Greece as well. We don't want to talk about Phoenician colonies in Greece, though, because that doesn't fit any of our narratives. But if we were to go purely by the archaeology, yeah, I think we could do it.
So really then this project is problematizing, is upsetting this very asymmetrical historical narrative where you just have mainland Greece as the absolute center and then everything kind of radiates out from it, like spokes on a wheel. And so this idea that other people could have been coming into Greece and that Greece is sort of responding in a way that these other communities seem to also be responding, or I'm trying to, because it is such a radical intervention, I think, in just like these very, very ossified narratives that I think if you think about them for any period of time seem problematic. But does this give us a sense of a more multicultural Greece or a more diverse picture of this so-called kind of Greek homeland?
Maybe. I think what I'm hoping it does actually is give us quite a different picture of what the ancient Greek world was, right? What it fundamentally was. So, I mean, we have been operating until now with this idea that Greece is a thing. And the Greek world, the wider Greek world, is formed by diasporic emigration out of the Aegean, right? However the debate has formed, wherever you stand in the debate, at the core of it is always emigration out of the Aegean in this kind of diasporic model. And that fits our Phoenician model. I think we, coming from perhaps a very 19th century nation state perspective, we think in terms of diasporas. And even a lot of our modern discourses about migration are about diasporic identities. And so we've framed the ancient world in this way. But actually, I really, really don't think the ancient Greek world works like that at all. So I think what we've got instead of kind of the pre-existence of a Greek identity followed by diasporic emigration spreading that identity, I think we've got completely the opposite going on. We've got a period of the kind of early Iron Age and the going into the very beginnings of the Archaic period, where we've got a lot of mobility, a lot of migration, but it's not so directional. This is much more of a kind of a Brownian motion of different people from different places going to different places in many different directions at once. And that absolutely includes a lot of regional migration whereby people are kind of crystallizing into new communities, and that perhaps is missing from many of our narratives. But then this phase of people going everywhere all at once all the time, then what you have after that is a moment of kind of retrospective ethnogenesis, where all of these people who are linked through maritime interconnections, they look back inwards and then kind of crystallize around a Greek identity. And so I think it's more, instead of like a diasporic model, it's more of a e pluribus unum model, right? There is original diversity, but after a while, there becomes less and less diversity because people are coming together and people are crystallizing around that kind of what they perceive to be, but also what they want to be, a common core set of culture, values, principles, ideas. And so I would want to think of the ancient Greek world less like an ethnic nation state and much more like a koinon, right? Much more like something like the modern European Union, where you have a bunch of disparate peoples who, for various historical reasons, begin to interact. And this fact of interaction creates cultural commonality. And in the right political and cultural circumstances, that cultural commonality can be crystallized into a common identity. And I think that's what we've got happening.
And this is one of your really key principles too, isn't it? That these narratives, then the foundation narratives, the identity narratives, these really, they don't just appear overnight, right? That they take a while to evolve. It's so interesting, I think, that in this project you are taking into account what we get in the preserved Greek literature is saying about themselves. I guess it's just so hard for me to resist immediately going to the beginning of Thucydides and these narratives about this is all about problems between a mother city and a colony, and then the daughter city, and then the granddaughter city. And there's a very sort of strong sense of the way that these cities are linked. But I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about what you have been observing in terms of the way that the foundation narratives and the way that our texts talk about these relationships and early origins, and what you've actually seen in the data.
I think what's interesting is having to gather together all this kind of mythological kind of data. I mean, we're really kind of approaching it from a more maybe archaeological perspective to try and see these fragments of mythical discourses as being almost analogous to ceramic fragments within an assemblage. So we're thinking in terms of a mythological assemblage, and to think about trends in that mythical discourse over time. And I think it's interesting that the discourse, I'm not talking about individual texts or individual authors, but across the discourse as a whole, sometimes the idea of Greekness is more important. But there are a lot of threads within this rich tapestry which talk about non-Greek origins and non-Greek identities, and they're often woven in there. But it's not so much kind of the coherence of any one story or of any one place. It's whether that theme becomes more important or less important. And there really are moments in antiquity when individual Greek cities almost don't want to be Greek, or don't want to couch their own identities in terms of Greekness. And perhaps the best example that we all know of is the idea of Athenian autochthony, and this kind of moment when Euripides kind of rewrites the genealogy of Ion, where he no longer is part of the Hellenic genealogy. He's kind of removed entirely. He's got no Hellenic blood in him whatsoever. And there's kind of a reimagining of the Athenians as non-Hellenes. And, we kind of paper this over, and a lot of Greek groups are doing this at different points in time, that they're playing with being non-Greek or being Greek and trying to see the horizons in history when this occurs, has been a kind of a big part of the work. And that's the ongoing part of the work, actually, the work part of the work, which isn't quite finished yet. I think we might need another year or two to try and pull that material together and really try and see those patterns emerging out of it. One thing that I do think is really interesting is the tendency within a Greek mythological tradition to see things in terms of genealogy and to write things in terms of genealogy. Now, there doesn't seem to be any problem with rewriting genealogies, or even, very famously in the case of Theseus, having two fathers, for example. You can have a mortal father and a divine father at the same time. So there's no problem with creating genealogies or slightly flexible genealogies, but it's interesting that it's couched in terms of genealogies. And I think this is distinct from what we get when we look at kind of origin myths in other traditions. And it's been really interesting to do some of this comparative work. We've been looking at origin stories in relation to from medieval Buddhism, from Tibet, from different parts of the world. And actually, the language of origin is not always genealogical. And I think that's something which is quite interesting, that seems to be a feature of the Greek tradition and not all human traditions.
So you're mostly then interested in these, if I'm understanding correctly, in these foundation myths and things like that, discursively from the era in which they were produced, not as if you're trying to track down the kernel of truth in them or something like in old school biblical archaeology, trying to find the place or confirm it or whatever. But you're interested in these as a kind of snapshot of how people were thinking about themselves and their identities at a particular time. Is that right? Or
that's exactly the approach we're looking at. And so what these myths were helping us to do really is to get at that moment of, it's get at that second phase, that retrospective ethnogenesis, right? So the archaeology, in a sense, helped us get at understanding the real patterns that went into the real making of these cities in a physical and demographic sense. And what the foundation myths allowed us to do is to get into the discourses which surrounded the kind of conceptual making of these cities as Greek cities, right? Which the assumption is often that the making of these cities as Greek cities occurs at the same time as the formation, the physical and demographic formation of these as urban communities. But actually, these two can be quite distinct processes, and they can be quite distinct in time as well.
The mythological material, that's going to form another volume from the project, is that right?
Yeah, so that's the second book, which is in progress, and I'll probably hopefully should be finished by the end of this year, but let's see.
Well, I think that it's just so exciting to see such a massive and ambitious project that's looking at both ends. I mean, that's the methodology. You're taking into account so much information. I have to say that from personal experience, I don't know how to put this diplomatically, but that a lot of archaeologists really don't like to deal with the text at all. I don't really know how else to say it.
I think that's fine.
I think it's really exciting that you have conceived of a project that takes all of these data points seriously in terms of understanding how you phrase it, what's really happening on the ground in terms of city formation, but what are the ideas that have come down to us about how people were thinking about who they were discursively, through narrative, through stories. I think it's really exciting the way that this project synthesizes both ends of the data spectrum.
I mean, I guess that's the aim, and that's because of being exposed to so super exciting and super innovative kind of philological and historical scholars like your good self, and seeing the kind of the ways that you engage with text. And it can be very easy to read ancient authors and try and mine them for nuggets of fact, but that is not only is that kind of methodologically and bankrupt, it's also boring, right? It's much more interesting to see texts as artifacts in the sense, right? They are constructions of their time, and we can look at them like we archaeologists would look at any other artifact, right? It's something that has been constructed, and that's what all kind of you and all my wonderful kind of more philologically inclined colleagues tend to do. And if we as archaeologists are not up to date with all the funky things that you guys are doing, then how can we possibly hope to understand what we're doing? Anyway, so it's good for us.
Nisha, what's next for MIGMAG? So the project is officially over in terms of the ERC framework, right? Ended on June 30th. But what's next for this work? How will it be carried forward?
So you're right, we are officially closed, which is very, very sad. We've still got quite a lot of work to do in writing that second volume, which has come out of the work. So writing the book on myths of origin and foundation, that is still very much underway, still in the thick of it, and really enjoying the writing process of that. But that's not yet done then. I think there are all kinds of kind of further directions that this could go. I think that the mythological work could really be a jumping off point. I think the methodology that we use for that mythological work could really be a jumping off point for expanding the corpus, looking at different regions, looking at different mythological traditions beyond the Greco-Roman, and seeking comparisons there. I think that would be a really exciting direction to go in. I also myself am really interested in community formation, right? And this has been a thread of my work, as you know, since I was doing my PhD. And the way that communities come together, especially if they are originally diverse, but then they grow together to become less diverse and more coherent and to share more in time. And I think that's a real interest for me. I think so for me, I'm going to be moving into kind of looking at structures of kinship moving forward, and especially kinship in diverse families, or families which kind of have a culturally diverse kind of set of different backgrounds, and seeing how that's framed historically and in terms of genealogical writing and genealogical poetry, but also thinking about how that's manifested in the ground as well, right, in terms of burying groups, burying populations as well. So that's, I think, where I will probably be going, but it might take me another 10 years, perhaps.
And that's okay. Well, I've been ending each episode of this season of the podcast, and this episode, in fact, is the last of the second season, by asking guests if there has been, or what you have maybe been doing or watching or reading or listening to lately that has been bringing you some joy.
So I've been reading this novel. It's a novel called The Overstory by Richard Powers, and it's this story about trees. I mean, it sounds really weird when you say it like that, but it's about a dispersed bunch of people whose lives kind of intersect, but at the core of it are trees. And actually the bits of this novel that I really enjoyed reading the most are the descriptions of people looking at trees and what that does to you. And it's made me go out and look at trees more, and that has made me very happy.
That's a great answer. It's a great book. That's a great answer. Well, thank you, Nisha, so much for coming on the podcast. Congratulations on wrapping up the official part of MIGMAG. I know there's more work to be done. I'm just so stunned by the scale of this project and all that you have managed to accomplish. It's really impressive, and I think it's going to change a lot of people's minds about a lot of really important things. So thanks for your hard work, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. It's been really lovely to be here.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesky Podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesky.